Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sarah Barth, and I've had the privilege of being the Executive Director of Semper Virens Fund for a little over 4 years. And I've also had the privilege of working in land and water conservation for several decades for my entire professional career. Welcome to Under the Redwoods. This is the first in a series of webinars that we're doing with supporters of Semper Virens Fund to explore the beauty, history, science, and benefits of redwood conservation and redwood forests. Bear with us, this is our first webinar. Like all of you, we're adjusting to the realities of Zoom. But all of you joining us today are the reason that really important redwood conservation work is happening in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so it really makes me excited to be able to have this opportunity through these webinars to go deeper into some of the topics that will help you better understand the work that you're supporting. Before we introduce this month's topic, I have some housekeeping tips to share with you so we can make the most of our time together. We can't see you, hopefully you can see us, and we can't hear you, which makes me a bit sad because interacting with our supporters is one of the best parts of my job. But we do have 3 ways that you can communicate with us, and they're all located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. First, you can utilize the chat function, and that's going to be monitored by Semper Virens staff. That's a great way for you to raise any technical questions or issues you might be having. Second option is to utilize the Q&A function also at the bottom of your screen, and that's a great place for writing down questions you'd like us to address, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. And third, you can actually raise your hand. There's a button you can click that will literally raise a little icon of a hand, and we'll be monitoring those as well so that we try to take as many of your questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And last but not least, I should let you know we are recording this and we'll put it up on the web once we're done. If you miss parts of it or you have others who you'd like to have see it, you can share it that way. While we can't see you, we do know you're there. And one of the things that makes Semper Virens Fund really an extraordinary organization, one of the most extraordinary things that I've come across in my entire time in conservation is the absolute loyalty of our supporters. And there are often multiple generations of a family that have supported our organization. So we want to start by doing a little poll with you to ask how long each of you have been involved with Semper Virens Fund, either as a supporter or in other ways a friend of the organization. So give it a try, click on the poll, and we should be able to see how many of you have been with us and for how long. I'm going to give you a moment to do that. Look at that. As expected, look at the huge percentage that have been supporting us 20 years or more, and combined with 10 to 19 years, over 10 years, and certainly over 5 years, we're getting to the vast majority of you. So thank you for your longevity with us and your enduring support for the organization. So despite all that's going on, that's crazy in the world right now, we are actually having quite a productive time. So I want to share with you some things that are happening in the organization. As I said earlier, I would love to be sharing them with you in person, but since that's not an option, let me just give you a snippet of insight into some of the things that you'll be hearing about from us. One of the things I'm most excited about is that we are on the brink of completing a land transaction that we will be able to tell you about, I hope, shortly. Very, very significant conservation effort that will mean enduring protections for some really important old growth forests. So I look forward to telling you about that in the future, and or you can read about it in the Mountain Echo. Not in the most recent issue because this deal hasn't been completed yet, but we're on the brink. You can read about some of the rewilding and restoration forestry work that we are doing now. That work continues despite the shelter in place and the pandemic and the economic disruption. We are still able to be doing great things for the forest on the ground. which is wonderful, and that you can read about in our most recent issue of the Mountain Echo, which you should have in your mailboxes and or you can get on our website. I want to note that this has also been a really extraordinary moment in our nation's history with regard to the discussion and advancement of issues relating to racial justice. And we commented on that as an organization earlier, but I wanted to just note that that's something that since June we've been really working to try to identify clear ways in which we can improve our own contributions and our own work to help make nature accessible for all and welcoming to all, and find ways that we can support our partners who are working to advance racial justice in the environmental movement. And then last, I want to flag for you that this week, we're still waiting for the news that it's been signed by the president, but a very important piece of conservation legislation was finally passed by the US House and Senate called the Great American Outdoors Act. And assuming that the president signs it as he has promised to do, it will establish permanent and full funding for something called the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And this is something that I've worked on over 25 years in my career to try to see happen. So to have it happen now is miraculous and wonderful. And the reason it's so important is because it will provide consistent, reliable, and significant funding available for both federal land conservation and grants out to states, including California, to support land and wildlife conservation. So that is a huge, when it is signed, it will be a monumental contribution to the canon of conservation laws. So with that, let's turn to our topic for today, wildfires. It's a topic that can be fraught with a lot of anxiety, and for good reason. Wildfire has always been a part of the ecosystem within which we work here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, but with climate change, more extreme and destructive fires are really now a problem year-round. And in some ways, they, at least in this region, have replaced logging as really one of the most dominant threats that we as a redwood conservation organization face, right up there with the threat posed by development. So it's a critical issue, and I'm really glad we're going to take some time today to delve into it a bit more deeply. Fortunately, organizations like Semper Virens Fund and many of our sister organizations are actively managing the forests and the lands that you have helped protect. And we work closely with the state agency, CAL FIRE, on stewardship practices that try to mitigate the risks of wildfire. And ironically, wildfire is both an incredibly destructive thing, but also a very necessary thing for rejuvenation of the landscape. So you need just enough, but not too much of it. Our speaker who's going to talk to you about this really interesting and complex topic is my colleague, Ian Rowbotham. He's a wonderful, wonderful colleague. He is our land stewardship manager, which means he's responsible for managing the over 10,000 acres that Semper Virens Fund owns and cares for. He's been with the organization for over 4 years. He has his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Stanford University in sustainable resource management, and he has really shown himself to be quite expert at caring for the lands that you all have invested so heavily in protecting. We are very fortunate to have him. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to speak for a bit, and then when he's done, we will take the questions that you've posted and try to answer as many of them as we can. So thank you again for joining us. You are the reason that phenomenal redwoods are being preserved, even in times of COVID, and we are eternally grateful for your for sharing with us in the vision for a thriving, healthy set of redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Ian.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, kind words, and for your leadership in the organization. Unfortunately, like Sarah said, I can't see everyone. I wish I could be with you all in person. But it is nice to host people at my house again, so welcome everyone. I will now pull up the slides. All right. So with recent devastating fires in California over the last few years and a near year-round fire season, the American public, and especially those of us in the Western US, are already coming face-to-face with climate change and a new fire reality. My plan in this talk is to take a quick look back at what's brought us here, where things are going, and what actions we're taking to create a more resilient landscape, both for humans and for the environment. Much of this talk is information I've gleaned my 4.5 years with Sempervirens from experts who've spent their careers on this subject. So at the end, if there's any information or anything I can't provide, we're more than happy to point folks to resources or those who are much more informed than me. The picture you see here in the background is of the 2016 Loma fire that burned about 4,500 acres in Santa Cruz County and Santa Clara County. You see here, it's from the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. Not too long after I started at Sempervirens, actually, I was flying into San Jose Airport at night when I saw this fire, and it really struck home to me how important this issue is for our work. And I also, at the time, thought I was going to be out of a job much sooner than I expected. So before diving into the broader story of fire here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, I'm going to attempt to give a very quick crash course in the basics of wildland fire. There won't be a test on this. The ideas will hopefully help in understanding when discussing where we are today and key points for us to consider for the future. So let's dive in. So for fire to occur, 3 things need to be present: oxygen, heat, and fuel. There's not much we can do about oxygen, being that it comprises about 21% of the air around us. Humans do play a key role as far as heat and fuel go, whether that be a spark from a faulty power line igniting a fire, or firefighters clearing areas of brush and vegetation to reduce what's available to burn. For both firefighting and for managing fire, these components are really key considerations. With those present, and when a fire does start, wildland fires are driven by the interaction of topography, fuels, and weather. These can get really complex, and I'll be quickly out of my depth explaining them, so I'll keep it concise and really high level on this. Fuels, first off, are the material that's consumed by a fire, and in wildland settings that can be grass, chaparral, redwoods, or even the leaf litter and pine needle duff, whether that be on the forest floor or on your back porch. Fuels burn differently. They burn in different speeds, different intensities, and how long they burn for. They're also affected by topography and climate differently and have major implications for the fire risk of an area and how a fire spreads. Topography can drive where a fire burns and how, and the fire burns faster uphill and slower downhill, which means ridges and ridgelines can be really important areas for controlling fires in that it slows down while crossing to the downhill side. Topography can also funnel fire up steep canyons, sometimes creating what's called a chimney effect, where heat rapidly rising up a steep walled canyon can funnel a fire up at high speeds. Topography also creates different fuels and moisture levels on the north or south side of mountains and different hill features. Weather can drive a fire forward with strong winds, slow it down, shift its direction, dry out fuels really quickly like grasses on a hot day, or shift things for the better with a well-timed rain. Extreme fire weather, marked by high and variable winds, high temperatures, and low humidity, can also create the conditions we've seen that have driven a lot of the largest fires we've seen in the last few years. CAL FIRE issues red flag warnings when conditions like this arise. So all these components are in play when managing and planning for fire, working to put one out, or even carefully prescribing one. The impacts of these fires are also felt differently by different species, with some much more adapted than others, or even entirely reliant on fire. So again, these are all pretty high-level looks at an extremely complex field, but as we go through the talk today, we'll start to reinforce these principles. So hopefully this sets up kind of a base foundation for us as we go through it. So as we start on our journey today, one key for us to keep in mind is the landscape and its habitats are not static and are constantly in flux from often competing disturbances and processes. Cycles of growth and succession, where habitats can slowly shift from grassland to scrubland to woodland, and where conditions permit in our region to conifer and redwood dominated forest. These states get broken up by intermittent disturbances like fire, flooding, or erosion and landslides that reset or alter that trajectory or change. With that in mind, another essential point about our landscape in the Santa Cruz Mountains, Monterey and San Francisco Bay areas, and really all of California and most of the Americas, is that what's here is in large part the result of many millennia of human presence and careful management of the landscape. Indigenous peoples managed the landscape with frequent burning to increase the productivity of certain plants for food, medicine, and resources, for hunting, to maintain open landscape for travel and visibility, and to foster increased biodiversity from that disturbance. And as such, it's a very fire-adapted suite of species that we have in our region. This mural here, which many of you have probably seen, depicts a settlement in Coroste Valley, which is located right near Año Nuevo, which would look very different then than it does now based on the types of management used in that time versus the years since. This indigenous burning management is evidenced not only in the species we see, but also by how fire typically starts here. This figure shows the density of lightning strikes across California. Again, a little wonky to look at, but basically the lighter pinks and reds denote more frequent lightning strikes. The blues mean less lightning strikes. What this figure highlights is that along the central coast in our region, we only see about 2 to 5 lightning fire ignitions per 100 square kilometers per century, meaning that our fire regime around here on the coast is largely defined by human-induced burning. This graphic here further illustrates that point. This is a reconstruction of the plant cover before colonization, done using early historical sources and accounts of Spanish explorers. While it's a little difficult to see in this format, and I realize a lot of you are looking on your computers, the light green color is grassland, the red here is redwood forest, and the tan is oak woodland. What stands out is that grassland covered vastly more area of the mountains and region previously than they do now. While redwood forest was still prevalent in the higher elevations and steeper canyons, the scrubland and chaparral habitat, which is dark green on this figure, that now covers vast swaths of coastal and mountain habitat, was sparse as a result of the frequent burning management regime used by Native peoples. Fire was a defining part of the landscape, and as we go through what's shifted in getting us to our current fire reality, it's key to highlight that the forceful removal and suppression of Native peoples from the area and the halts in their management and use of fire really kicked off the major shifts in our landscape to kind of define the new fire reality that I'm going through today. Since that time, use of the land has changed dramatically, with some specific activities having outsized impacts on where we are today in regards to fire. In the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, early and mid 1900s, as the population in San Francisco and Alameda County and the broader Bay Area boomed, intensive clear cutting occurred across the Santa Cruz Mountains and across the state, eliminating the vast majority of old growth forests in the region. Old growth redwood forests are particularly fire resistant due to their thick bark, wider spacing between trees, high canopy, and ability to withstand rot and insect damage even after being significantly burned. These are features that are important for fire and also kind of what drive their magnificence. Redwoods also resprout from their base pretty prolifically, which I'm sure many of you have seen and experienced as fairy rings, where almost circular hollows or groves of redwoods form. It's a truly magical thing to experience and stand within one, but replacing individual old growths with dense clusters of second growth trees often resulted in overcrowded forests that are more prone to fire and also provide much more fuel for those fires. In some areas, what was once conifer dominated has also been replaced by other, sometimes less compatible species and assemblages. The effects of clear cutting and the shifts in forest composition still have a major impact to this day, particularly as it relates to fire. The images you see here on the screen on the left show a massive old growth being cut. You can tell it's probably cut in the late 1800s, early 1900s by the fact that they're using springboards, which are those wooden planks sticking out of the side, which kind of a cool note as you're going through a redwood forest. If you see a taller stump with what look like little notches cut into them, that tree was probably cut pre-chainsaw in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when they would have cut it by hand and inserted springboards, those planks, into the notches to then climb up and cut it a little higher up where it's a little narrower. The image on the right shows a clear-cut area and cut logs being pulled downstream in a dry creek bed, where they would often use ox trains or, in some situations, steam donkeys or steam engines. The most striking change in the broader Santa Cruz Mountains, though, is, of course, the extreme and enormous population growth that we've seen around here. Where this is of particular concern is the ever-expanding WUI. For those of you who haven't heard this acronym, kind of funny sounding acronym, WUI stands for Wildland Urban Interface. And this represents the zone where structures and human development intermingle with undeveloped land, vegetation, and fuels. In 1900, the population in San Mateo was roughly 12,000 people. Santa Cruz County was about 21,500, with about 5,000 people in rural areas. By 2018, the population has since ballooned to 770,000 in San Mateo, 276,000 in Santa Cruz, with 164,000 people in what's considered rural areas. This picture here shows how that growth has presented itself in the WUI or WUI portions of the mountains. The picture here we see is an aerial shot taken in 1940 of Scotts Valley. In the bottom right of the photo, you can see what is now Highway 17. This picture shows the exact same area taken from Google Earth in 2020. While many of these neighborhoods can feel suburban and out of harm's way, they are very much part of the broader wildland firescape in the mountains here. This mixture of an increasingly varied wildland boundary has also mirrored near century of intensive fire suppression throughout California. For CAL FIRE and other agencies, the prioritization in fighting fire goes life first, then property, then the environment. As such, the first step is getting people out safe, then protecting infrastructure. Significant resources have gone into keeping fires as small as possible, which has been very effective for the first two priorities, but one result of which has been that habitats have accumulated biomass far beyond what would have been present with more regular burning. And that burning can clear out the understory fuels, can kill weakened trees, and promote more open landscapes and fire-adapted species. This not only creates much higher intensity fires like we've seen in the last few years, in which I'll go over more, but also creates a sort of feedback loop where high intensity fires are more common, meaning allowing those fires to burn is inherently more dangerous to life and to property, and more fuel is then allowed to build up when those fires are suppressed early and when they're small. This culminated in deadly fashion in the 2017 and 2018 fire seasons in California, where we saw record acres of land burned. So before I go into the specifics of the 2018 fire, I wanted to take a poll actually to sort of to gauge how many fires folks think have already been detected in 2020. So we can compare what you think to what we saw in the 2018 season. So hopefully you've seen the poll pop up. So go ahead and put in your answer, and we'll see how your knowledge compares. All right. So it looks like there were a lot of guesses for 500 here. The correct answer actually is 5,000. We've seen over 5,000 fires already this season in 2020, which in comparison to 2018 is pretty high. But for reference, in 2017, we had over 9,000 fires that burned that year. So a jarring number, but it's important to remember that this is statewide. And the good thing is that CAL FIRE keeps these fires pretty small. But again, definitely a sobering thing to think about with, over 5,000 fires already, with potentially 3 to 4 months more of fire season. So again, like I was saying, the 2018 fire season in California was the deadliest and most destructive on record, with over 7,600 recorded fires, nearly 2 million acres burned, 24,000 structures destroyed, and over 100 deaths recorded. It's a sobering example of what we've gone over already: buildups of fuel, intense weather conditions, people spread throughout the WUI, and human-induced conditions. Unfortunately, this is our new normal, so gaining an understanding of the likely impacts of climate in the future will help better prepare us for what's next. The figure here shows what everyone has likely already heard. The temperatures are already rising and are expected to continue to rise throughout our region. The different colors correspond to different climate models. This model shows anticipated temperatures in Sonoma County. The black line represents historical data that we've already gathered. And while there's variability in how much temperature increases, there's agreement in which direction it's going, and that's up. One critical aspect that's less clear is precipitation, though. Again, the colors here correspond with different models, the black line showing historical data for Sonoma County for anticipated rain per year in Sonoma County. Rainfall is dependent on numerous complex cycles that can span ocean basins like El Nino or more local impacts like fog, which makes modeling and predicting these difficult. But it also means that it could create multiple potential scenarios that we might see in the future with either a warmer, wetter future contrasted with a hotter, drier one, or some subsequent mix like that. As I mentioned earlier, this will have different impacts on different species and could result in new mixes of species emerging or major shifts in habitat types as species ebb and flow in different areas to find and to sort of chase conditions that are ideal for them. While there's a lot of variability in this, generally the conditions will be less favorable for redwoods in our region at the southern edge of its range. And we may see transitions from conifer-dominated forests, like the image on the left taken here near Davenport, to a landscape with more chaparral and scrub, with redwoods occupying steeper canyons and refuges where conditions stay cool and moist, like this image on the right. You can see my mouse. You can follow the redwoods there. Another key factor that we've already discussed is that extremes on both ends of temperature and rainfall will also be more common, whether that be extreme heat days, high rainfall storms in the winter. Extreme conditions create situations where high intensity, fast spreading fires are more likely. In some ways, what we'll really be seeing is the new abnormal. Pause for laughter there. It's not all doom and gloom though, and I hope I haven't terrified everyone too much. It's again, a very sobering topic. Even through all this, there are significant actions taking place across the region, and the efforts of all of us here are playing a major role in that. We're installing shaded fuel breaks across many of our properties, partnering with agencies like CAL FIRE, state parks, as Sarah alluded to do that work. Shaded fuel breaks are buffers along roads or ridge lines where the understory is thinned out to limit what's available for fire to burn, while the canopy itself is left alone to shade out and slow the regrowth of what's been cleared out. This helps if a fire approaches by slowing it down and allowing firefighters to confront it head on, or even as an area where firefighters can burn in advance of a fire to constrain or direct a fire's movement. The picture seen here on this slide is from our 8,500 acre San Vicente Redwoods property, which we co-own with Peninsula Open Space Trust, where we've installed over 10 miles of fuel breaks and are currently working on installing 8 more miles in partnership with the Bonnie Doon Fire Safe Council, Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County, and CAL FIRE. What's notable about this, you can see a sign put up by Bonnie Doon Fire Safe Council. You can kind of see the thinned out understory and the canopy remaining above it, shading it out. But what's really notable about this is that in the 2009 Lockheed fire, the main road running down the ridgeline through San Vicente was actually used as the holding line for CAL FIRE to halt the Lockheed fire before it spread towards Bonnie Doon and Davenport. So these activities and infrastructure installed, whether it be water tanks or maintaining fire roads, do have key impacts in fighting fires around communities. This is another picture of a fuel break that we partnered with this City of Santa Cruz Water Department with. This is not a shaded fuel break, but similar fuel break that surrounds the Loch Lomond Reservoir located near Lompico and Loch Lomond. Another tool we're hoping to use more is fire itself. Prescribed burning adheres to a carefully crafted plan and allows fire to do our work for us in consuming fuels in an area and can be tailored to provide a wide range of benefits that were a key part of indigenous burning management. At San Vicente, CAL FIRE has managed to burn over 30 acres along Empire Grade, including a burn encompassing 22 acres just this past February. That work has strengthened a shaded fuel break that was already there. As part of this effort, we also partnered with the Amamutsan Land Trust, a nonprofit created and overseen by the Amamutsan Tribal Band, to study the impacts of the burns on species traditionally valuable to the tribe and native peoples, species like hazelnut, as well as for the Amamutsan Tribal Band and the Amamutsan Land Trust to participate in the burn with a traditional fire starting ceremony, as it represents a return to traditional practices used for thousands of years to tend the land. We've already seen exciting things emerge as a result of this work and are excited to share more of those results in the future. Through our restoration forestry work, which Sarah mentioned earlier is ongoing at San Vicente with currently a 120 acre and a 500 acre project happening simultaneously out there. Through this work, which uses thinning techniques from the forestry industry actually, we're aiming to accelerate the development of old growth conditions in forests heavily impacted by past clear cuts. The image here on this slide, while a little fuzzy, shows a typical grove that we would target that shows the results of clear cutting. So if you can see my mouse, you can see 3 old growth redwood stumps here in these areas, surrounded by about 20 to 30 second growth redwood trees. These second growth trees are impacted by the heavy competition for resources and sunlight in growing back so densely. And not only do they not grow as tall or develop characteristics of old growth trees as quickly or at all, they become more susceptible to fire themselves. Thinning out these groves around the more dominant individuals allows for better growing conditions, seen here at a project of ours, while also breaking up the spacing of fuels in the area to create a more fire-resilient forest. The early results from one of our first restoration forestry projects in the region we conducted in 2012 near Castle Rock State Park has shown faster growth in thinned areas and actually increased understory biodiversity. So this is a picture from the site that we did the work in 2012, and you can see the increased spacing, kind of less fuels touching each other, more space for the trees to extend and grow their lower hanging limbs, which in the previous picture, oftentimes these trees that are highly competitive with each other and really densely overgrown will shed their lower branches and only have canopy way up near the top and sort of almost like a lollipop, versus these trees that have been, once they've been thinned out to allow the more dominant, larger ones to grow, can develop the broader branches that are key for marble murrelet habitat, many other species, and help store more carbon. Collaborative efforts across our region help leverage even more progress on a landscape scale. The numerous fire-safe councils in the mountains, often volunteer-run and driven by grants and donations, play an essential role with outreach and education, organizing chipping campaigns in local neighborhoods, mobilizing homeowners and communities to improve resiliency of human elements, make life easier for firefighters, and get people really engaged in the topic that's so critical for them, and even overseeing large-scale projects like the work of the Bonnie Doon Fire Safe Council I mentioned earlier out at San Vicente. Members of the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network, whose logo you can see in the middle there, which is a collaborative group of land managers, public agencies, and even timber industry partners that Semper Virens played a pivotal role in starting, have been leading an effort to produce a fine-scale vegetation map across Santa Cruz and Santa Clara counties. This work has already been started and completed in Sonoma County and Marin County and is ongoing in San Mateo County. The veg mapping will create tools that help in a wide range of conservation goals and will be publicly available, but it has real implications for fire management, whether that be mapping ladder fuels, which are understory vegetation that when burned can send flames up into the canopy of adjacent trees and increase the intensity and spread of that fire. The mapping will also be able to identify habitat types, building footprints and the location of buildings or impervious surfaces like roads that's key for access to fight fires and for retrieving people who are out in the wooey or potentially trapped by a fire. The Stewardship Network is also partnering with the Peckerwood Preserve to produce a climate assessment for our region, its plants, habitats, which is a key tool in prioritizing conservation actions, given the multiple future climates we might see that we discussed earlier, whether that's warmer and wetter, hotter and drier, all have different implications and are really key for figuring out where we want to put resources, what habitats we want to prioritize, and what are the most vulnerable locations and potentially most vulnerable species, whether that be redwoods or whether that be sandhills habitat. Statewide grants from CAL FIRE have also increased dramatically of late, and locally have been fantastic partners in advocating for projects and helping oversee those projects. And efforts by our local resource conservation districts in Santa Cruz and San Mateo County are further helping spread those benefits and opportunities to smaller landowners for those projects. All this is to say that we're in this together and momentum is truly building to tackle these issues holistically. This work doesn't come without its challenges, whether that be cost, meeting the scale that's needed, forming necessary partnerships, or just grappling with the need to repeat efforts every so many years, but it's one we're trying to meet head on. Thank you all for joining and for your ongoing support. I hope this was valuable to you guys, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. With that, I will pass it back to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Ian. So you and I well know that this work is not one and done, and whatever fear you had when you saw the Santa Cruz fire about being out of a job, you have no risk of that. And I guess the question I have for you is the forest restoration work that you described and the other fire mitigation efforts that we engage in. Can you say more to folks about how often we need to do that work, and how do we at Sempervirens Fund know when we've accomplished our conservation goals with this work?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So a lot of it, the work, and again, in describing a shaded fuel break, is that the plants continue to grow, things continue to grow back. So some of this work, whether it be a shaded fuel break, you need to go back and maintain those areas and re-clear those areas. And so across a broader scale, there's a lot of work that needs to be kind of remobilized every so many years. And so what this takes is either scaling up our effort simultaneously with prioritizing it so that we do that work in areas that are most in need and where we can have most benefit for either sensitive habitats, whether it be an old growth redwood grove, or whether it be a community like Bonnie Doon or Ben Lomond that's really integrated out into the mountains there.
Great, thank you. All right, everybody who is on this webinar, if you would like to ask a question, it looks like we may have a couple already in the Q&A. Remember that you can either raise your hand electronically at the bottom of the screen of your screen, or submit one electronically in the Q&A section, and we'll try to answer some of these questions for Ian.
Hi, Sarah. We do have a couple questions that have come in.
Great.
The first, Ian, you showed temperature and rainfall models for Sonoma County. Is there similar modeling for the Santa Cruz Mountains region?
There have been statewide efforts for putting together climate assessments for the greater Bay Area, but those models that I used were taken in part from Pepperwood Preserve, which is based up in Sonoma, and does a much more fine-tuned analysis for a specific region. So a lot of the models that we use and that you see in IPCC reports and things like that are taken across really broad scales and can often kind of overlook certain local conditions and things like that. So what we're hoping to do for our region and working with Pepperwood and the broader members of the Santa Cruz Mountains Stewardship Network is to do that modeling specifically for the Santa Cruz Mountains across our few counties here, so we can get a much more fine-tuned map and set of data that will help us really approach conservation here in this region, as opposed to using data that's on a much broader scale. So once we have that data, that's what I would be intending to use for sure.
Ian, thanks. We also have a question about what would one do, who would one call to survey their land in Santa Cruz or anywhere in the region to make a better fire protective environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an important one. You can actually reach out to CAL FIRE on that. They do inspections of homes, and they can help as far as figuring out potential strategies you might want to do, whether it is, there's 100 feet of defensible space you're supposed to maintain around your home in a wild and urban interface area. So they can help as far as thinking through that thing or the different strategies you might want to take in doing that. There's also private contractors who help assess that and do work with larger agencies or larger landholders to help manage that type of work. So there's also resource conservation districts that I mentioned that you can look into that do work with smaller private landowners throughout the mountains and have resources to help there, as well as there's kind of a wide range of entities, but one that is helpful to initially reach out to is CAL FIRE. They're sort of the experts in that.
Thanks so much, Ian. Another question, you mentioned restoration forestry. Is there a particular example of a successful recreation, restoration forestry project that's been completed? And what has determined that success?
Yeah, so some of the work that we're doing here, and again, the project I mentioned in 2012 was a first really for the Santa Cruz Mountains, but it's not the first restoration forestry project that's been completed in general in the Redwood Range. A lot of our work is working with different professors and researchers who've done projects in far northern California, up in Humboldt and Mendocino counties, Redwood National Park and other regions like that, where they did this work decades ago and have been able to record data from the decades since to see the results of areas that were thinned, that had been clear cut and were really densely grown, versus areas that didn't receive that thinning. So a lot of the work we're doing here, while somewhat different climates, different topography, that kind of thing, we've been able to base the work we've been doing off of successful projects that have been done up north and are continuing to happen up north. So that's to say also that our 2012 project, well, again, very preliminary results after 5-6 years, and these trees grow over the lifespan of 1,000 to 2,000 years. So what you see in a 5-year period, you can't jump to too many conclusions on. But what we've seen has been really promising in that we've seen faster growth in areas that did receive that thinning. We've seen higher biodiversity in areas, in part that there's more sunlight getting to the understory. And with that spacing, there's been a breakup of fuel. So in theory, that would help as far as being able to either do a prescribed burn in that area, or if a fire naturally spreads through that area.
That's really terrific. Thanks for sharing that story. We have a bunch of more questions coming in. So I'll make sure we get to these. Do we know what indigenous people in the region did with regard to forest management?
So there's kind of a whole range of activities that have taken place. I don't want to, it's not an area that I'm necessarily an expert in any way, but I do know as far as fire management, that fire was often used for sort of multiple benefits and for the enhancement and improvement of a number of species at a single time. It might be doing burning in an oak woodland that not only promotes the benefit of certain grass species that they harvest for foods or for basketry and weaving, but also to make it easier for collecting acorns. What we've seen as far as fire return intervals in a lot of areas, while this work is still hard to do, is that a lot of areas have higher fire return intervals than might be anticipated, again, like with lightning strikes and that sort of thing, where human and burning by indigenous peoples would happen fairly frequently and had benefits of clearing out understory, reducing the frequency of or the intensity of fires in that area. So there's a lot of really active and thoughtful management that taken place for millennia out here. So
one of the things I'm most proud of, one of the projects I'm most proud of, is our partnership with the Amamutsin tribal band, who are descendants of the Ohlone people and whose descendants used to occupy many of the lands that we now work to protect and restore. And we've had a fantastic partnership with them in which they've come in and done some of the forest management, forest restoration, and in particular helped with prescribed burning. That has been both ecologically restorative, but also has been very healing for the tribe, allowed tribal people to come back onto this land, practice traditional practices, engage in some cultural restoration. And that's been very rewarding to see. And we had a lot to learn from them in terms of forest and fire management.
Thank you both. We have a question about visiting a site where redwood thinning has happened. Are there any places where somebody might go and see the practice in practice?
As far as opportunities in our region, the projects that we've done are still ongoing. Some of it is long-term monitoring, and so those project areas in some sense have been intentionally away from where public access is, just to maintain the integrity of that work. There might be access further up north and where those other project areas are, but it might also be something of interest for once we can get out with people to maybe bring people out to visit some of these sites if there's interest, because again, it is, it's a stark difference in what we're seeing, but also again, a great opportunity to get out in the woods and explore and talk about these projects.
That would be great. Here's a question. With the state of California pulling back from adding any land to existing parks, are we experiencing a shift in the burden of what fire, what kind of impacts fire can have?
I would say that as far as our work goes, State Parks has been very active in managing fire, both in doing prescribed burns. They are very active in pulling off prescribed burns where they can, albeit burning is very limited by air quality and finding the exact right conditions that fit within your prescription. As far as the burden shift, some of it is us taking on that responsibility ourselves as we take on larger pieces of property like San Vicente Redwoods, and doing the sort of long-term management activities that are necessary there. But State Parks has taken a very active role as far as whether it be fire infrastructure with water tanks and maintaining roads, as far as that goes. I don't know if Sarah, if you had anything to add there.
I think you touched on it, but while State Parks is unable to take new land for addition to the state park system, we wind up holding and owning land for far longer than we as an organization ever used to. And that means that we are the ones who are responsible for forest restoration, management of fire, mitigation of fire risk. And so we are increasingly functioning more and more like the state parks system in terms of both caring for the land, protecting it from various kinds of threats, and opening it up to sustainable types of recreation. And so that's a emerging role for us, and that's been a real shift for the organization in the last decade or so. But it's also given us an incredible opportunity to learn more about the ecology of redwoods, to do some experimentation that's been useful to state parks and other land managers who own redwoods. So we're finding that it is both increased work for us, but also increased mechanisms for providing conservation benefits to others with our learning and our research that has reverberations outside, positive reverberations outside our region.
That's great. Thank you both. Here's one more question. How does the wildlife population react to forest fires? Specifically, how long does it take wildlife to repopulate after a burn?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Hopefully we'll have more information as, at San Vicente Redwoods, we've set up some really extensive wildlife monitoring arrays to be able to see that. So hopefully someday as we are able to do a larger burn, we might see that in our own region. But in 2017, some of the larger fires that took place in Sonoma at Pepperwood Preserve, they had already set up a wildlife picture index, sort of a grid of cameras that they'd set out in the landscape. And some of those fires burned right through those areas. And in some of their pictures, you could see animals fleeing the fires and then, even within days later, returning to some of these areas, depending on the season and what moisture is available. Even in the areas that we've done prescribed burns out at San Vicente, you do see plants coming up not too long after these fires happen. Again, some of these larger fires now are happening in October and November, where rains happen pretty soon afterwards. So there are opportunities for animals to come right back in and see kind of that rejuvenating pulse of growth following a fire. But in some areas, depending on the intensity of the fire, some areas might not see growth for a while afterwards if it was a really hot, burning, intense fire. So it varies in different areas, but it has been heartening to see how quickly a lot of wildlife adapts and returns to these areas. Because again, it's not just plants that are fire adapted and really benefit from fire. It's also the animals that are, a key part of that habitat too.
I think this really strikes at the very core of this issue, which is so important for redwood lovers to understand. Some amount of fire is good for redwood forests, and as Ian said, is a source of rejuvenation, the phoenix rising from the ashes of old lore. And so when you see that kind of regrowth happening quickly, then you know it was an okay fire or okay enough. What we're worried about and what we try to manage for is the really extreme conditions where you have a catastrophic wildfire that's so hot and so destructive that worst case scenario is it takes out trees, plants, animals for a generation. It's a stand called a stand replacing fire where, what you're left with is charred earth that really is not going to be productive in an ecological sense for a long time and may never return as a redwood forest. It may result in a different type of ecosystem returning in terms of the vegetation, and that in turn affects the wildlife that return. That's what we're trying to mitigate against. That's what we don't want to see happen. And yet with climate change and past fire suppression practices and really dense forests, that's what we're up against. That's the risk. And so that's why I said at the very outset, fire is one of our biggest concerns as people who care about having a thriving, enduring, resilient set of forests that blanket Santa Cruz Mountains. We've got to figure out a way to help those fires be able to have low intensity, rejuvenating fires rather than the catastrophic fires that we worry about.
Wow, that's great. Thank you both. I believe we have one raised hand for one live question, and we're going to get them access now. If you had your hand raised, I think you should have access to ask your question. Sounds like we don't. That's fine. And I've got one last question, and then I think we'll wrap up. I'm curious about unfragmented wilderness. Is that a factor in considerations for fire management?
It certainly is. I mean, one of the, so in the slide where I talked about fire suppression, as far as that very intensive attempt to quell fires before they get too big. One great example of that is the Semper Virens fire that took place in Big Sur, where this was largely in very wildlit areas with very little human infrastructure or human presence in that area. And there were intensive efforts by CAL FIRE and other agencies to stop that fire, even though it was largely burning in the wild. And lots of money spent, lots of effort, even a life lost in doing that work. And it sort of begs that question of, are there areas where we leave those areas to burn and just focus our control around human habitation? And there are so many benefits of having larger core habitat areas. And I think how we handle fire in those areas where there aren't humans and there isn't infrastructure nearby is a really important question, because while there may be high intensity fires in some patches and maybe kind of a mixed regime of fire happening in those areas, as Sarah's alluded to multiple times, it is a natural part of the landscape and results in kind of a greater diversity in that landscape. So I think rethinking how we look at fire in some of these larger blocks, which, when it comes to fire here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, there are people in so many areas that it may be a question that's sort of better asked and better addressed in areas where there are truly larger blocks of core habitat. But I think it's a really important one as we assess fire and habitat in the mountains, and that fire can be a very beneficial, and has been for millennia, very beneficial disturbance on the land. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ian. And I would say in general, going back even to my days of a long time ago of graduate work in conservation biology, that larger chunks of protected, conserved land that are intact and not fragmented, not broken up by roads or other infrastructure, generally are better for conservation. And I think that also applies here. Although ironically, we need roads in some cases in this landscape to be able to access should a fire start, and we need to have CAL FIRE or others get in and help stop the fire. So as Ian said, this is an incredibly complex topic. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us for this conversation. I wish it could be more live, but we as a society aren't quite there yet. We'll look forward to the day when we are. But we do want to invite you to join us for next month's webinar. We touched upon wildlife several times in this conversation, so I'm delighted that we chose a speaker who I think will be of interest to you. It's Dr. Chris Wilmers, who is a scientist and professor at UC Santa Cruz. He is also the head of something called the Puma Project, and his expertise is in mountain lions. And he's done an incredible amount of research on our properties and elsewhere around how mountain lions utilize the Santa Cruz Mountains. And he's a really fascinating speaker. So I invite you all to register for that talk and join us for it. Yeah, with that, I'll wrap this up and just say this was our first webinar. We are learning, hopefully like you learned, and we would welcome your feedback. Tell us how we can make these webinars better and more enjoyable for you. Reach out to us and let us know what would make the experience even more enjoyable. And with that, I'll thank you again for being supporters of and friends to Sempervirens Fund. We do amazing work to preserve redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and really, we are just here to embody the vision that you all support for thriving, healthy, connected redwoods and all the wildlife and other species that depend on them. So thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you, so to speak, on our next webinar. Thank you very much.